Tonight, the Eastern Mediterranean has been operationally contested in a manner that its post war strategic architecture was never designed to accommodate. What unfolded in the waters west of Haifa, south of Cyprus, and across the maritime approaches that Israeli naval doctrine has treated as sovereign operational space for 3 decades was not an engagement whose consequences can be bounded within the bilateral frame of the Iran Israel confrontation. It was a targeted disabling of 7 Israeli naval assets by an anti ship missile barrage, whose volume, approach geometry, and terminal characteristics had been specifically engineered against the defensive systems protecting those vessels. Executed with sufficient precision to remove 7 platforms from operational availability, while simultaneously communicating to every commercial operator, every allied navy, and every regional actor whose strategic calculations incorporate assumptions about Eastern Mediterranean maritime security that those assumptions require immediate revision. 250 anti-ship missiles, not the saturation volume that earlier Iranian naval strike doctrine employed as its primary mechanism for defeating defensive systems through numerical excess, but the precisely calculated quantity whose distribution across 7 target platforms and whose approach geometry had been determined through years of studying the specific defensive configurations and operational patterns of Israeli naval assets operating in the Eastern Mediterranean, to produce the disabling effect the operational objectives required, without the expenditure of the larger inventories that Iranian doctrine reserves for the higher intensity scenarios whose deterrent value depends on their unconsumed availability. The operational logic embedded in this specific quantity communicates something about Iranian strategic calculation that the number itself does not fully convey. 250 missiles was not the maximum Iran could have fired. It was the minimum sufficient to achieve the specific operational outcome the engagement was designed to produce. And the discipline of firing the minimum sufficient rather than the maximum available is the signature of a military planning process that understands the difference between operational success and strategic overreach. 7 Israeli naval assets disabled. The Sa'ar corvettes, the missile boats, and the patrol vessels that constitute the Israeli naval surface presence in the Eastern Mediterranean, platforms whose Barak missile defense systems and electronic warfare suites had been assessed by Israeli naval planning as providing the survivability margin required to operate effectively against the threat profiles regional adversaries could realistically generate. That assessment was built around a threat model whose parameters had been defined by previous engagements and by intelligence assessments that had underestimated the specific combination of missile volume, approach vector diversity, and terminal guidance sophistication that the barrage delivered. The defensive systems aboard the targeted vessels performed within their specifications. The specifications had been exceeded by the specific characteristics of the engagement those systems were asked to defeat. The Israeli Naval Surface Force operates on an operational doctrine whose foundational premise is that the Eastern Mediterranean is a permissive environment where Israeli technological superiority in sensors, electronic warfare, and missile defense provides a survivability margin that regional adversaries cannot meaningfully contest. That premise has been qualified before, most notably in the 2006 INS Hanit engagement, where a single Iranian-supplied C-802 missile struck an Israeli corvette under conditions of defensive inattention that subsequent doctrine addressed through procedural and technical improvements. What distinguished last night's engagement from the 2006 precedent was not the principle that Israeli naval assets in the Eastern Mediterranean can be struck. It was the demonstration that they can be struck at scale, across multiple platforms simultaneously, through a coordinated engagement whose planning depth exceeded anything the 2006 incident had suggested was available to Iranian naval strike capability in the Eastern Mediterranean theater. Iranian anti-ship missile planners had studied the Israeli Naval Surface Force with the analytical depth the operational problem required. The conclusions they drew concerned the specific defensive coverage geometry of the Barak system aboard the Sa'ar corvettes, whose engagement envelope provides reliable intercept performance against threats approaching within defined bearing and altitude parameters, but whose coverage is constrained at the outer boundaries of those parameters in ways that approach vector selection can exploit. They concern the operational patterns of Israeli naval assets in the Eastern Mediterranean, the patrol routes, the formation spacing, the timing regularities that operational necessity imposes on any naval force conducting sustained presence operations in a defined geographic area. They concern the specific salvo density against each targeted platform that would force the Barak system into simultaneous engagement against the maximum number of incoming threats within the compressed time window that would exhaust its ready magazine inventory before the total incoming volume had been addressed. The first wave, approximately 80 missiles, was directed against the northernmost elements of the Israeli naval presence operating in the waters south of Cyprus. The approach geometry distributed the incoming missiles across bearing angles that forced each targeted vessel into simultaneous defensive engagement against threats arriving from multiple directions, preventing any platform from concentrating its defensive output against the primary threat axis. The Barak systems aboard the targeted vessels engaged the incoming missiles with the rate of fire their doctrine specified. The performance achieved was within the system's operational parameters. Against the simultaneous multi-bearing approach geometry the first wave employed, those parameters were not sufficient to defeat the incoming volume before the ready magazine inventories of the most heavily engaged platforms had been substantially depleted. Two vessels in the northern element sustained impacts from the missiles whose terminal flights the depleted defensive systems could not address. Both were disabled. Neither sank, but neither retained the propulsion, the weapon systems, or the communications infrastructure required to continue contributing to any operational mission. The second wave, approximately 100 missiles, targeted the central element of the Israeli naval disposition, incorporating a higher proportion of sea-skimming missiles whose flight profiles compressed the detection to engagement timeline available to the Barak systems defending the targeted vessels. The electronic warfare environment the Iranian operation had established preceding the first wave had degraded the data link connectivity between the targeted vessels and whatever airborne early warning coverage Israeli Naval Command had positioned over the operational area. Vessels operating on degraded early warning coverage have less time to cue their defensive systems against incoming threats, whose first detection occurs at shorter ranges than the standard engagement doctrine assumes. The combination of compressed detection timelines and the multi-bearing approach geometry the second wave employed produced the engagement conditions under which three more Israeli naval assets sustained the disabling impacts, whose operational consequences the morning's assessment is now documenting. The third wave, approximately 70 missiles, completed the engagement against the southernmost Israeli naval element and addressed the remaining operational capacity of the vessels that had survived the first two waves in damaged states. Platforms that had sustained impacts in earlier waves but retained partial operational capability were targeted with the residual wave volume, ensuring that the disabling effect the operational plan required was produced comprehensively rather than partially across all 7 targeted assets. The southernmost element, operating at the greatest distance from the Israeli coastal base infrastructure that provides the logistical and communication support naval operations require, faced the third wave in an electronic warfare environment whose continued Iranian activation had maintained the detection and coordination degradation that the opening of the engagement had established. The anti-ship missile systems employed across the 3 waves represent the maturation of an Iranian naval strike capability whose development trajectory Western assessments have consistently evaluated against the wrong operational benchmark. The relevant question was never whether Iranian anti-ship missiles matched the performance of American or Israeli naval strike systems across every technical parameter. The relevant question was whether they achieved the specific terminal guidance accuracy, the sea-skimming altitude discipline, and the electronic warfare resistance required to defeat the specific defensive systems protecting Israeli naval assets in the eastern Mediterranean at the engagement ranges the operational geometry of the theater imposed. Against that benchmark, the systems employed last night achieved the performance the operational plan required, and 7 disabled Israeli naval assets are the operational confirmation of that achievement. The production infrastructure underlying the availability of 250 anti-ship missiles for a single engagement in the eastern Mediterranean reflects an Iranian naval strike investment program whose geographic reach has expanded well beyond the Gulf theater that earlier Iranian maritime doctrine treated as its primary operational environment. Positioning the anti-ship missile inventory required for an eastern Mediterranean engagement through the supply chains and the pre-positioned storage infrastructure that the operational execution required, represents a logistics and planning achievement whose execution had been invisible to the Israeli intelligence assessment that was supposed to provide the warning the Naval Command needed to adjust its operational posture before the engagement occurred. In Tel Aviv, the hours following confirmation of 7 Israeli naval assets disabled produced a governmental and military response whose character was shaped by the simultaneous requirements of managing the immediate operational consequences, assessing the intelligence failure the engagement revealed, and calibrating the public communication of an event whose strategic implications extended well beyond the immediate military balance. The operational consequences were immediate. 7 disabled vessels represent a substantial fraction of the Israeli naval surface presence in the eastern Mediterranean, and their absence from operational availability removes the patrol coverage, the maritime interdiction capacity, and the presence mission execution that Israeli naval doctrine assigns to that presence. The intelligence failure was equally immediate. The barrage had arrived against an Israeli naval disposition that had not been adjusted to reflect a threat assessment commensurate with the engagement that occurred, which means the assessment that informed the disposition was wrong in ways the post-incident analysis must now establish. The commercial maritime consequences of 7 disabled Israeli naval assets in the eastern Mediterranean are transmitting across the shipping industry's risk assessment infrastructure with the speed that demonstrated threats to naval assets in a commercial transit corridor always produce. The eastern Mediterranean carries the bulk of container traffic flowing between Asian production centers and European consumer markets through the Suez Canal approach routes. The insurance underwriters providing coverage for vessels transiting those routes are reassessing the premium structures that their risk models specify under the demonstrated threat conditions the engagement has established. Shipping companies whose route planning incorporates Eastern Mediterranean transit as a cost and time efficiency assumption are evaluating the alternative routing options whose longer transit distances impose costs that the previous threat assessment had not required them to absorb. The allied navies that operate in the Eastern Mediterranean under various partnership arrangements and mandate missions are conducting their own assessments of what the demonstrated Iranian anti-ship missile reach into this theater means for their operational postures. The threat that disabled 7 Israeli naval assets last night does not distinguish between Israeli and non-Israeli hulls in its terminal guidance logic. Every surface vessel operating in the Eastern Mediterranean now does so in an environment whose threat parameters have been operationally redefined by an engagement that Iranian planning capability had demonstrated extends to this theater with the precision and the volume the barrage delivered. The waters west of Haifa are quieter now than they were during the hours the missiles were arriving. 7 Israeli naval platforms are being assessed, towed, or held on station by damage control teams managing the consequences of impacts whose effects on propulsion, weapon systems, and command infrastructure have removed those platforms from the operational inventory for a recovery timeline that the extent of the damage will determine. In a maritime theater where 250 Iranian anti-ship missiles can disable 7 Israeli naval assets in a single coordinated engagement and disrupt the commercial and strategic assumptions underlying Eastern Mediterranean maritime security, what does naval presence actually guarantee? And on what defensive foundations can that guarantee rest when the foundations existing last night proved insufficient against the engagement that arrived? Iran has provided its answer through years of anti-ship missile development, extended into the Eastern Mediterranean theater, and validated that answer in a single pre-dawn engagement. The rest of the region is still calculating what that answer costs them, and the calculation will determine the maritime order that emerges from these waters for the generation that follows.